And first, I'll introduce the subject. Then we'll come to the first speaker, that is you, sir. And after you have spoken, the second and third speaker, and we'll have the question answer collectively. At the end, we have about 35 to 40 minutes for that. And after the question answer session, the President Cass will give his remarks and thank the participants. And that's where we'll close the session.
Okay, I should talk for about a quarter of an hour.
Sir, about 15 minutes,
Yeah.
a little plus minus. Sir, I think we are on time now, so
Yes,
I
you
will
can
seek your
start.
permission to start.
Sure.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening in Pakistan, and a good afternoon in UK. I am Air Marshal Ashfaq Arai, Director Strategic Defense and Security at Center for Airspace and Security Studies, Islamabad. I, on behalf of President and CAS team, welcome the distinguished panelists and the guests to this webinar titled Hybrid Warfare Against Pakistan, Challenges and Response Options. Hybrid warfare as a term entered the modern strategic lexicon in early 2000s, despite having been practiced in various forms for a long time. Commonly defined as the blend of both kinetic and non-kinetic options to offset the conventional power dynamics, hybrid warfare includes extensive use of tools like disinformation, propaganda, economic coercion, backing of proxy militia, and cyber attacks, etc., by an adversary state to achieve its strategic objectives. While it is an old concept in military strategy, in the modern times, owing to exponentially high cost of men and material in traditional warfare, not only great powers, but various middle powers too are engaging in hybrid warfare to destabilize, demoralize, and disintegrate their core adversaries. Besides, arrival of new technologies in 21st century also incentivizes the blend of different modes of warfare, making hybrid warfare a practical option to meet the political objectives. The unique aspect of ambiguity and deniability makes it an attractive option for the aggressive states to use hybrid warfare without fear of attribution and retribution. Pakistan's arch enemy, India, has continuously been waging hybrid war against Pakistan since its inception, only to be expedited recently with increased funding, training of separatist militia, conducting economic subversion by politicizing international bodies such as FATF, and carrying out diplomatic sabotage in the form of disinformation campaigns. Disclosures by EU Disinfo Lab are a very recent example. Before inviting the speakers, I would explain the format. Each speaker will express his views in about 15 minutes. At the end, we'll have a combined question and answer session. Participants can direct their questions to a specific speaker or the panel through chat box or question box. After the Q&A, President Cass, Air Chief Marshal Kareem Sadat will offer his concluding remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, the first subject to be discussed is conceptualizing the theory and practice of hybrid warfare. Our distinguished speaker, Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman, will elaborate on how hybrid warfare as a concept has evolved over time. What are the fundamental tools being used by the users of hybrid warfare and how unpredictable are they? What are the empirical evidences which prophesize its status as a key feature of future warfare? How are the evolving technologies affecting both offense and defense in hybrid warfare? Sir Lawrence Friedman was Professor of War Studies at King's College London between 1982 and 2014 and Vice Principal from 2003 to 2013. He now holds the position of Emeritus Professor in the Department of War Studies. Before joining King's, Sir Lawrence held research positions at Nuffield College, Oxford, IISS, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In 1997, he was appointed as official historian of the Falklands campaign, and in 2009 was appointed to serve as member of the official inquiry into Britain and the 2003 Iraq War. His most recent books are Strategy, A History 2013, and The Future of War, A History 2017. I'll now request Sir Friedman to take the mic.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be with you. It's an important topic, and I'm very interested to hear what you all have to say. I'm going to concentrate on the sort of broad conceptual and strategic issues associated with hybrid warfare. I really am not in a position to comment on the policies and strategies of India and Pakistan on this, but so I'll just stick to what I know about. As already mentioned, there's nothing particularly new bringing together different forms of warfare as part of the same overall strategy. Indeed, it's impossible to imagine a war of any size or significance being conducted in one way alone. They're always hybrid to a degree. The term came back into use, I think again was mentioned in the earlier part of this century, but I think largely with bringing together regular and irregular forces, so that you were using both conventional operations and guerrilla operations, terrorism even, at the same time. The additional parts now, again, as we mentioned, come with cyber attacks, information warfare, maybe economic measures as well. And again, there's nothing particularly new about this. They're part of any war strategy. Has been to put economic pressure on your opponents, and certainly to use sabotage and propaganda and deception. You just look at the Normandy landings, for example, in 1944, and deception was a rather critical part of that, using measures that obviously don't have the advantage of the digital age, but they're not different particularly in kind to some of those that are discussed now. And I think you could see, if you look back at the history of warfare, and where there's an attempt to bring different modes of fighting and pressure together, that certain standard problems always emerge, of which possibly one of the major ones is command and control. If just to take an example that is often used about hybrid warfare at the moment, in Ukraine, Russia has mounted a conventional threat, but a lot of the and used regular forces at one point extensively. But most of the action that one assumes to be on behalf of Russia is by groups which are only loosely linked with Moscow, and Moscow has had an awful time trying to exercise some control of them, because they have different agendas. Moscow sees these groups as being a useful way of putting pressure on Ukraine. The objectives of these groups is to integrate with Russia. And as you've got different political objectives, then you tend to get tension between the two. And I'm sure you can think of examples from your own region where the regular and the irregular parts don't always, as we say in the UK, sing from the same hymn sheet. They have got different objectives. The reason why it's become more important, why more attention is spent on this, is I think largely because of the problems with major war. And it sort of pushed activity away from entering into conflict as easy as might have been the case, say, in the 18th and 19th centuries. The whole experience of the 20th century with its two world wars, but also the arrival nuclear weapons, which is obviously relevant to you in India as well, has really transformed thinking. If you if you are very nervous and anxious about a major war and its consequences, then you're naturally going to try to exert influence by other measures. And this has been developing for some time, particularly the use of economic measures. Certainly the United States, at the first hint of a disagreement with a country or finding a country's behavior objectionable, will turn to economic sanctions as almost a first resort, because it's a way of signaling something without actually normally imposing an awful lot of costs for the US. So I think that the arrival of what's called grey zone conflicts has been a very important factor of this, that countries don't stop having conflicts, don't stop having disputes, but they want to try to move them along by measures short of war. And come back to in a moment the problem of actually resolving measures, resolving disputes by these means. The second thing that's obviously also made a difference is one thing is the entrance into the nuclear age, the second is the entrance into the digital age. And really since the 1990s, there's been increasing fascination with whether or not the dependence of modern societies on the internet, on the web, has created opportunities for opponents to cause problems that just weren't there before. Sabotage, propaganda are not new, but you have opportunities now to explore them and exploit them that just weren't there in the same way before. So again, you now think with at the start of any conflict, as part of any conflict, she's again just looking at Ukraine, because Russia in particular tends to do this, that a denial of service attack on government computers, or attacks on power supplies or whatever through the internet, often through breaches in their security, are almost like economic sanctions, a first resort. Plus, you have the fact that using the various social media platforms, which we have to keep in mind are still quite new, and really only exploded when smartphones came along in 2007. But they provide opportunities to spread information, but also disinformation on a wide scale. So I think there's been a sense of growing vulnerability to attacks from these sources. What's less easy to work out is how important, and this is where I think the conceptual questions become significant, is though we feel the vulnerability, to what extent do these provide real opportunity for opponents? We haven't as yet, despite if you look in the 90s, talk of electronic Pearl Harbors, of surprise attacks where it's almost like the plug is pulled out from your whole society, and the air traffic control stops to work, and power stops to work, and banks stop to work, and so on. This hasn't happened. You've had bits of it, and you've had some serious attacks, but it hasn't happened. By and large, the bulk of the activity, the hostile activity on the internet, is criminal groups. Sometimes just mischief makers, but criminal groups, some at quite low level, some at quite high level, are the main users, and the main victims are individuals, possibly banks, companies, and so on. It's not particularly statecraft in any way. There's an element, that element is there, but it's not the major activity. And the forms of resilience that are necessary to develop to cope with the criminality actually provide you a degree of resilience against state activities. But it's certainly it's certainly there. You also have the question of what this can achieve, which I think is bound up with the question of attribution, which was mentioned. So if we can take examples where there's an attack on a particular company or on a particular activity, nobody claims responsibility. And that can be disruptive or mischievous, but what politically has it achieved? If you don't know who's done it, what do you then have to do in order to get them to stop? Because you don't know what their demands are. You don't know. You don't know whether or not the person you suspect is, or the state you suspect is responsible, is actually responsible. So it's an irritation, but it doesn't necessarily force you to do anything different, because you're not actually dealing with a set of political demands. As soon as political demands are issued, then you know who's done it. And then issues then start to arise about how you respond. And there, as you will know, there are big debates going on in the UN and elsewhere about whether a serious attack on using the internet that can still have very material consequences can be constituted an act of war. And if it is, you don't necessarily just have to respond by digital means. You can use other means to respond, and you might. Or else, as we know, I mean, the UK has talked about it in relationship to ISIS. You can develop offensive measures that can start to disrupt opponents in return. But we don't know enough about this at the moment, because it's still pretty underdeveloped as forms of strategy. But I think the attribution issue is really quite important. It allows you to do things and possibly get away with them, but it's actually then quite hard to follow up. And then you have the other problem, and I think the follow-up question, if you're not actually in a wider military conflict, is important. You don't take territory by a cyber attack. You cause disruption, but it's not clear how you follow through. I mean, it's a similar debate to the one that you have with air power and land power. You can do a lot of destruction from the air, but you don't actually seize anything unless you follow up on land. So I think that is also an issue. Moving quickly on to the question of information warfare and propaganda, it raises again similar issues. It's clear, and you can again look back to the role of the BBC from really since it began, is now seen as an important example of UK soft power, as it were. But it only is so long as it can be trusted as a source of news. As soon as it's clearly a propaganda outfit and doesn't mention unfortunate things about the UK or where the UK's got itself into trouble, as long as it's just a source of news, then it can have a lot of influence because people will trust it. And trust is very important to the ability to wage, to influence through information. And again, I think we're still at a very early stage of working out how effective a lot of these measures are. What happened in 2016 with the US election and a number of other elections in which Russian groups certainly tried to interfere is that to the extent they were successful by picking on and amplifying divisions within the target society. They didn't create a lot of the stories that were important, say, helping Trump to power in 2016. They picked up on debates and they magnified them, they amplified them, and this certainly had importance. But where we've seen attempts by Russia to introduce ideas and thoughts, fake news, if you will, that has no basis in the target society, it tends to flop. And you can see examples in the UK we had with the Salisbury. Sorry about that. My wife will answer. With the Salisbury attempted killings, attempted assassination. When you have that, the Russian attempts at disinformation failed completely, and they ended up looking rather foolish. So again, it depended on the credibility of the messages, not just on the ability to sow them, and that became an important part, still I think an important part of our evaluation of these techniques. So let me just quickly conclude. I think there's no doubt that the digital sphere is a very busy one, and very important in modern conflict. It's there it's there to be used. It's used by all parties to a conflict, one way or another. It can be used for sabotage purposes, and we've seen examples of that, although none from which the target countries couldn't recover. But that could become more serious. In the information sphere, it's just messy, I think, because there is so much, there's a cacophony of messages out there. And we're seeing at the moment, take another example, the anti-vaccination campaigns. I mean, all our countries are now approaching the issue of vaccination one way or the other. Some countries, this is a much more contested question than others. And you can see similar arguments being used to oppose it and to attack those opponents. Now, who's doing this, whether this is just homegrown, whether this is coming from outside, is difficult to say. And of course, it's, it can be quite easy for a country that is unhappy with a particular set of arguments going on within that country to blame external powers for it. So is it warfare? Especially when nobody gets killed, when there's no actual violence. I think the most important uses of, if you look at the past conflicts, the most important uses of sort of the sabotage element actually has come when there's been armed conflict underway, when it has been possible to disrupt, say, command and control or air defense systems or something like that. These seem to me to have been the most influence. And that, of course, is in the end a proper sort of hybrid warfare. So I tend not to I would be wary about overstating the importance of these effects away from the kinetic element, if you like. But with the kinetic element, they can provide an important boost. But the reason that we pay so much attention to them is because we're still very nervous about getting into too many kinetic wars. So I think that's about my time. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. I think a very important point has been made that the adversary will always pick up and amplify the divisions within a society. And the response option also has to be based on reducing the fissures and divisions within the society. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, Ambassador Abdul Basit, will discuss India's hybrid warfare against Pakistan with a focus on what hybrid means or irregular methods India employs to imperil South Asia's stability. How has India exploited various instruments of hybrid warfare to create problems in its neighboring countries? What is Indian hybrid warfare strategy against Pakistan? What are the vulnerabilities of Pakistan that India is exploiting for or can exploit? What's the role and significance of international community in the context of India's hybrid aggressions? Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Abdul Basit is a retired Pakistani diplomat who was appointed as the High Commissioner of Pakistan to India in 2014. Previously, he had served as Pakistan's ambassador to Germany from May 2012 to March 2014. During his career, he has been posted at Moscow, New York, Sanaa, Geneva, and London. He also served as Foreign Office spokesperson and hosted a TV talk show. Presently, he is the president of an Islamabad-based think tank, Pakistan Institute for Conflict and Security Studies. Sir, Ambassador Basit, the mic is yours, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for inviting me, and what a treat to listen to Sir Professor Lawrence Friedman. Thank you very much, sir, for your very enlightening conceptualization of the fifth generation warfare. In the context of India, let me begin by saying that during my tenure or stay in New Delhi as Pakistan High Commissioner, I had many opportunities to meet India's National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval. And on many occasions, I also discussed with him his offensive defense doctrine, and always underlining that since India's fifth generation warfare is also involves a kinetic element, so that makes it more dangerous and inherently hazardous for not only for Pakistan and India, but for the entire region. But the details of my meetings, my discussions would be available in my upcoming book titled Hostility, which should be out sometime this month, I believe. Coming to India's objectives, broadly speaking, there are two objectives. One is to keep Pakistan politically unstable, and second is to keep Pakistan economically weak. And these two things obviously are to keep several objectives in mind. One is Kashmir, obviously, because India wants Pakistan to become irrelevant when it comes to Kashmir. And then other issues to keep Pakistan under pressure so that other issues like Siachen, Sub Creek, they're all settled or one way or the other on Indian terms. So Pakistan India has employed all the possible tools to wage this warfare against Pakistan. Now, this is being waged at I would say 4 different levels. We often forget that India's narrative, or whatever you called it, is credible, not credible. It is also addressed to Indian Muslims and Kashmiris as well, especially Indian Muslims, because India has always been, and particularly under this dispensation, Modi dispensation, has been trying to create a narrative that Pakistan is a failing or a failed state. The partition of the subcontinent was a huge mistake, and Indian Muslims are far better than either Pakistanis or even in Bangladesh. There is a problem that they want to convince the Indian Muslims that they are better off in India, so that they are kept kind of under pressure as well, and also marginalized to a certain extent. So fifth generation warfare against Pakistan also has internal dynamics. It is also part of India's electoral politics as well. So we also keep that in view. On the other hand, at the crux of India's warfare is Pakistan armed forces, as I look at it, because India has tried to build this narrative that India always wanted to have good relations with Pakistan, but it is Pakistan's army, it is Pakistan's military which would not allow this relationship to normalize. And it is Pakistan's army which is not even allowing a solution to the Kashmir dispute, because when Pakistan and India were engaged on the back-channel diplomacy to work out a solution on the basis of President Musharraf's 4-point formula, it was the army which conducted or supported or funded the Mumbai attack in 2008. So army is portrayed as the biggest problem when it comes to Pakistan. And it is also projected that Pakistan's defense expenditure is illogical, in the sense that Pakistan needs to invest more in its development, but because the entire rationale for the existence of armed forces is to defend itself against India. So much is being, spent on Pakistan's defense and security rather than on other important issues like education and health. So Pakistan's armed forces and our premier agency ISI are the biggest target, in my view, of India's fifth generation warfare. Secondly, it is also the other factor which is, there is how to further exploit our fault lines. For example, Balochistan is one area, and that has to be seen in the wider context of Pakistan-India relations and also CPAC. Because, as I said, the larger objective is to keep Pakistan economically weak, and CPAC is obviously an important project for Pakistan to take off economically. So hence, we would see that how Pakistan is portrayed as a problem country in Afghanistan, our so-called relations with the Taliban, Haqqani network. So all these, things are exploited and part of the Indian narrative that Pakistan is a problem country, both in the context of India as well as Afghanistan. And it is Pakistan which is not delivering the Taliban. And Taliban primarily are being supported by Pakistan. So regionally speaking, again, Pakistan is a problem country because it is Pakistan which is not allowing the integration and connectivity in South Asia. It is not allowing Afghanistan, India to have trade through Wagah. It is Pakistan which is against railways or motor vehicle agreement which Pakistan opposed in Kathmandu in 2014. So Pakistan is a problem country, whereas India wants to, have economic integration, economic interdependence, but it is Pakistan which has not given India most favored nation status, which India granted to Pakistan in 1996. So it is Pakistan which is a problem country. Internationally, Pakistan is a problem country because the Taliban have links with Al-Qaeda. There is also a space for Daesh in Afghanistan. And then the issue of nuclear proliferation also comes up. So all these things, are being kind of being projected tirelessly by India. And then internally as well, blasphemy issues, minorities issues, kind of, Hindus are being suppressed, oppressed by Pakistan, and then blasphemy issue in particular, human rights problems. So all these, make a good mixture, provide India kind of good base to build its narrative. Now, obviously, one other aspect which comes into play is that it is also addressed to a certain extent to create some chasms between Pakistan and China as well. And this is another aspect in this warfare. Though India is trying its level best to create more and more wedges between Pakistan and the Western countries, particularly the US and other Western countries. But China is also part of that game, the Indian game. And we have to be mindful because it is quite a serious challenge for Pakistan. Now, how Pakistan can address these issues, Marshall and I very rightly pointed out that unless we have vulnerabilities, we put our house in order, our adversary will continue doing that. But my worry is, and I told Mr. Ajit Doval also, that this cold start doctrine, the kinetic element, can create a huge problem for all of us. And what happened after Pulwama and how India reacted is failed Balakot operation, and the way Pakistan very legitimately and rightly reacted, that can escalate the situation. So hence, as Professor Friedman very rightly said, that the combination of the two is a very dangerous, can create a very dangerous situation. So for Pakistan, to counter this Indian fifth generation warfare is, first of all, Pakistanis themselves are not, it is a psychological, it is being fought in the psychological realm. And Pakistanis and India is trying to create some kind of restlessness in Pakistan, that Pakistan is not on the right track, democracy-wise, human rights issues, and development issues, particularly the development in Balochistan and other in Sindh rural areas. So we provide India kind of through our own political the system, the way our system works is very unfortunate that we provide ammunition to India to build on that. And that is the biggest problem as far as I am concerned. On Kashmir itself, because we have not been very consistent in our Kashmir policy, we do not know our bottom lines. Hence, India is taking full advantage of that. And we would see in the months and years ahead that India would also try to create situations for us in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, as well as in Gilgit-Baltistan. And that is also part of its propaganda and disinformation campaign. Then, our focus is too much on multilateralism, unfortunately. We believe that multilateral fora or institutions can deliver on their own, which is not the case. Multilateral, you can achieve results in the multilateral domain if you have good, solid bilateral relations. Unfortunately, in the past, we have not focused on building bilateral relations, barring a few countries, but when we expect too much from UN, OIC, and other international organizations to come to our, to be supporting Pakistan on different issues. Take, for example, FATF. There was no reason for FATF to put Pakistan on the grey list when Pakistan was being led by a caretaker setup in June 2018. FATF, the decision was obviously politically motivated, and India was behind that. If it was not politically motivated, FATF should have waited for the elections to have taken place, and then it should have discussed the roadmap with Pakistan, the new government in Pakistan. But before the new government could take over, Pakistan was grey-listed, unfortunately. So that shows how India is, playing its game so deftly at all fronts. And Pakistan has to now come up with a well-calibrated strategy as to how to counter Indian moves, because all said and done, Pakistan is moving forward. We have dealt with the issue of terrorism. We have also given many huge sacrifices in that. Pakistan's record on Afghanistan is very clear. We also always wanted to have a negotiated settlement of the Kashmir dispute, But it is India which has kind of come up with this narrative that terrorism and talks cannot go together. But Pakistan has not come up with a counter narrative. We have always been apologetic, I think, by and large in our responses. And here the problem lies. We need to have a clear strategy as to how we should be dealing, because India, it is not for Pakistan to exploit India's fault lines, because I personally feel that false narratives have a particular shelf life. As you know, we have seen this InfoLab revelations recently. India's propaganda does have some value, no doubt, and it has given India some kind of advantages over Pakistan in different areas. But at the end of the day, Pakistan needs to put its house in order, in my view. If we can do that, I'm sure we are in a better position to counter India. And particularly on Kashmir and Afghanistan, I do serious issues because India is also creating this kind of disinformation in occupied Kashmir that Pakistan is losing interest now. And this is, if this continues and this gains ground in occupied Kashmir, then I think Pakistan will indeed become irrelevant. Though we will continue issuing the statements, we will continue having these seminars and conferences, but we have to look at these things realistically. Because India, despite its Hindutva philosophy, its fascism, and whatever name you give it, it is important that we keep things in their proper perspective. I, for one, have always, unfortunately, in Pakistan, we also, our leadership is very quick in issuing the statements and calling Modi names, which I have kind of, always felt bad about it, in the sense that Modi, we all know where Modi is coming from, but it is not for the fifth generation. For warfare is not to be fought by our leadership. It is to be fought in a different manner. If we have to counter India's moves, India's fifth hybrid warfare, we have to be more intelligent and try to learn how narratives are built and how false narratives are countered. That is, I think, the basic point which we need to learn. And I'm sure that with such conferences and seminars, these would help us to better understand as to what the challenges are and how we need to tackle them. So it's a complex game, no doubt about it, because it is being played at various levels, systemic, subsystemic levels, internal, both India and Pakistan, internally as well. So it is multidimensional. So Pakistan has to come up to counter this, as I said, in a well-calibrated manner, rather than doing it in fits and starts and with no concrete results. So let's hope that we all learn from our mistakes and create and put ourselves in a better situation to deal with India's long-term objectives and put Pakistan house in order, put our act together in order to deal with this more effectively. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much. This was Ambassador Abdul Basit, who defined the Indian objectives of Pakistan, keeping Pakistan politically unstable and economically weak, and maligning it regionally and internationally. Our third speaker for the evening is Lieutenant General Amir Riaz, who will discuss countering hybrid warfare, Pakistan's response options. He would focus on what are Pakistan's vulnerabilities as a nation, which make it an easy target for exploitation. How can India make Pakistani citizens enemies of Pakistan, and Pakistan can only watch helplessly? What are the inadequacies of Pakistan's current strategy to counter hybrid warfare? And what should be salient tenets of Pakistan's approach to defend itself against this threat? Lieutenant General Amir Riaz, his Hirale Imtiaz military, was commissioned in a distinguished battalion of Frontier Force Regiment in 1984. He is a graduate of Command and Staff College, Quetta, and National Defense University, Islamabad. He holds a master's degree in Science and War Studies from Qaid-e-Azam University and Diploma in Defense and Strategic Studies from University of Malaya, Malaysia. He has varied command and staff experiences and has commanded 2 corps of Pakistan Army. He has been on the faculty of School of Infantry and Tactics and Command and Staff College, Quetta. He remained president of National Defense University, Islamabad from December 18 to October 2019. I will now request Lieutenant General Amir Riaz to give his views, especially as a practitioner in the field.
Thank you very much, sir. It is always a difficult task to speak at the end, particularly when the earlier speakers are such heavyweights and a lot of valuable insights on the subject have already been shared. Therefore, I've chosen to keep my discourse very brief. But if I were to use an analogy to describe hybrid warfare and its chief purpose, it is like introducing a virus in human body which first attacks the immune system in order to weaken it and then create a condition wherein the immune system itself starts to attack the body which it's supposed to protect until the body is completely incapacitated. And so in terms of a state, this immune system rests in the relationship between the state and its people. People have hope, confidence, and trust in their state. This trust generally takes form of a social contract, which could be in the form of a written formalized document or an unwritten tradition-based understanding. So what does the state do? The state, on its part, is supposed to ensure the territorial integrity and sovereignty, and it is supposed to equalize opportunities for its citizens. It is supposed to protect the rights of its citizens, which is right to life, honor, property, and political freedom within the confines of the social contract. And it also looks after the socioeconomic needs of its citizens, particularly the less endowed ones. Now, therefore, the fundamental target of hybrid warfare is this social contract. By gradually incapacitating the target state and eventually disenchanting its citizens to a point where this trust is broken and people start to actively engage against their own state, mostly without calculating the consequences or the cost of it. To achieve this kind of an effect, hybrid warfare against a state by another state or a group of states, it has to take form of a sustained, unrelenting application of non-military and military means. Military means are generally applied very selectively. Now, for this high-end objective and sustained application, there has to be a deep-seated and unremitting hostility and very high stakes, particularly if the contest is between two nuclear-armed states, because the possibility of hybrid crossing over into a major military conflict will always remain, and with obviously unintended consequences of unbearable magnitude. In India-Pakistan context, since February 2019 and events following from there on, both deterrence instability and crisis instability margin has increased and situation is delicately poised, if I may say, just one irrational act away from a major military conflict. Though we live in a very chaotic international order, but I'm sure all responsible members of the international community must be taking a serious note of it. The present Indian ruling elite, which is led by RSS-cooked BJP, with its fascist, extremist, and irrational exposition, is posing a serious threat not only to its own state and society, but also to its neighbors. Therefore, they're creating a general sense of instability and security in the region at large. And I think Ambassador Abdul Basit has already spoken about it at length. India, for quite some time now, has embarked upon a policy of forcing its smaller neighbors into submission. It has worked for some time, but now even its smaller neighbors, having become wary of this unscrupulous aggression, have started to retort. Uh, as regards India-Pakistan scenario, I'm reminded of a talk that India's National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit, was giving at a university several years ago, to which I think Ambassador Abdul Basit also referred to, uh, which I paraphrase, was suggesting to give fillip to hybrid war against Pakistan. And there are many other politically influential people in India's ruling elite who do not mince their word about waging such a campaign against Pakistan. So it is a matter of fact, Pakistanis will have to understand this full well, that Pakistan is subjected to a full-scale hybrid assault by India. But unfortunately, it is also supported to varying degrees by some of its Western allies, uh, obviously because of their own geoeconomic and geopolitical reasons. So India is employing all elements of its national power to varying degrees in this pursuit. The current Indian leadership has made in entire Pakistan agenda central to its domestic political discourse as well. Now, if I have to sum up how the Indian campaign, hybrid campaign is built, it is built on the construct of dime fill. That is diplomacy, active diplomacy against Pakistan, information warfare, which is propaganda and cyber warfare, low intensity military application, as we see it happening every now and then on the line of control. It crossed a certain level after Pulwama, and economic and financial squeeze as much as they can apply. And their intelligence agencies doing all that they can to accentuate all fault lines that are available within Pakistan. And India is also resorting to lawfare at the international level against Pakistan. FATF is one example of that. The objectives are quite clear and they don't make any bones about it. It is to malign Pakistan externally. It is exploiting all available fault lines within Pakistan, may they be ethnic or social or sectarian. They target the key institutions, and I think it has been very well laid out already by the ambassador. The idea is to create a despondency and weaken the social contract between the people of Pakistan and their state, eventually forcing Pakistan to give up on its legitimate interests and submit to New Delhi. The problem, however, with India's ruling elite at the moment is that they have kicked up so much of dust within their own country while they're disturbing other states around it, that the world, despite India's economic lure, may not be able to stand with her for too long. Uh, Hence, making its hybrid war against other states, particularly Pakistan, it may become cost ineffective in due course of time and unsustainable as well. However, in the meanwhile, we cannot sit and wait and hold our response. If we have to configure our response, uh, there are four key elements. The first is that we have to develop the true understanding of the nature of hybrid war being unleashed against Pakistan. I'll talk about it a little later as well. And then we have to look at the situation of political and social harmony, disharmony within our own state. And there is no other way, we have to improve our governance to overcome our vulnerabilities. And the governance has to be delivery based. Hybrid warfare, as we know, is here to stay in one form or the other, and it is here for a long time. So therefore, we need to have now organizational structures at federal and provincial levels which are integrated with each other to develop a common understanding of threat and develop cohesive and synergetic responses. Now, if I have to define in strategic terms or in a strategic posture, then Pakistan has to adopt a defensive offensive posture against this threat. And by defensive posture, I definitely mean that we have to put our house in order and we have to keep our immune system strong and resilient so that we can deal with this offensive Indian hybrid campaign and still be able to respond. So for that, consolidation of the common understanding of threat and response across the entire political divide, it is an essential, it is a must. We have to relook at some of our constitutional amendments to make Pakistan's financial governance manageable. In the present construct, it is difficult, and this is being exploited. We have to improve our governance by empowering the local bodies with financial authority and responsibility. It is absolutely not possible to govern such large provinces in terms of territory and population and deliver governance down to the grassroots level. We have to come up with the federal and provincial structures with constitutional backing to deal with our critical fault lines, ethnic and sectarian and others. At the political-military level, as I said before, that the deterrence instability is there. We have to re-establish the deterrent stability in the India-Pakistan context. In the offensive domain, although some activities are taking place, that is to expose India's real face to the world, but it has to really become more imaginative and creative using the tools of diplomacy and information. But should India continue on its offensive hybrid war, I have a feeling that Pakistan's hand will be forced one day. And a matching response will have to be put in place, matching offensive response, accentuating India's fault lines, which are abound. As they say in Urdu, but I like to translate it in English, when you're sitting in a glass house, you don't throw stones at others. And in this case, India is itself sitting in a glass house. There are twofold objectives of our response, should be our response. That is, India should give up its hybrid warfare against Pakistan, hybrid warfare, offensive hybrid against Pakistan. And India's ruling elite should learn to conduct its affairs with Pakistan through diplomacy within the norms of international law. In the end, I would say, I see that you're looking at your watch nervously. I'm going to finish with the last statement. It is your immune system which must be protected. And that is the internal resilience of Pakistan that can only come through putting our house in order and covering our vulnerabilities. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. General Amir has made a very important point that the internal immune system has to be made stronger through social harmony, improved governance, and to have the structures within Pakistan. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the House is open to all for question and answer session. We already have some questions, so I will start with the questions, and just to save time, I'll put 2 questions or 3 questions at one time so that the 2 speakers or 3 speakers can respond. The first question is from Mr. Malik Ahmed Rafi to Ambassador Abdul Basit. Don't you think that Pakistan has become a world's top battleground due to its pivotal role in CPEC, which Pakistan's enemy cannot bear? The second question is, sir, do you think our media cell is not as active as it should be? We are far behind to portray our positive Pakistan image. This question may also be answered by Ambassador Abdul Basit.
Yeah, I think that CPAC does create stirrings around the globe, since US is, we haven't seen any statement emanating from Washington, DC, supporting BRI, and CPAC being the flagship project of BRI, puts Pakistan in a situation where the entire, or the Western countries led by the US are particularly worried, because BRI is important for China's rise, for its sustained economic growth. So US does see BRI as well as CPAC as challenges to the US. I remember having, I was talking to Alice Wells, a former assistant secretary, when she was visiting Pakistan. And the narrative in Washington, DC, or in India is very clear that CPAC is a trap for Pakistan. And as what happened to Sri Lanka, Hambantota Port, the same will be Pakistan's fate. It's a debt trap. Pakistan is conceding its sovereignty to China, and so on and so forth. So India, as well as with the support of other global powers, will continue creating problems in Balochistan through Afghanistan, and that goes without saying. And I have always been saying that the US would never leave Afghanistan. And now, today, NATO defense ministers have met in Brussels. So, and the vibes are that they have decided to continue their stay in Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan will remain a problem area for Pakistan. And because through that, they will continue creating problems in Balochistan through proscribed organizations like BLA and BRA and so on. So, as far as media is concerned, I absolutely agree with you that Pakistan, our media is least sensitive about Pakistan's interests, in my view. It can be for any reason. It is because of our media is not, we do not have professionals in our media. Then there is the interaction between the government and the media is not really based on some thinking which is kind of provides tools to the media to counter India's false propaganda against Pakistan. So, and then, there are 3 or 4 Indian channels, English channels, which are viewed worldwide. If you look at Pakistan, our PTV world does not, rather reflects poorly on Pakistan, which has not been up to the challenge, to the newer challenges. And Pakistan, the government of Pakistan, and I think needs to focus on this as to how we, especially on building Pakistani media, especially English media and the other important languages, for example, Arabic, because we are losing space in the Gulf region as well. I do know for a fact that how India subsidizes its tariff lines to make Pakistani exports to the Gulf countries non-competitive. And we have lost a huge space to India's labor market, manpower in the Gulf countries as well. So Pakistan needs to focus on these things. As I said in my remarks, Pakistan needs to focus on bilateral relations. I'm glad that our Prime Minister would be visiting Sri Lanka next week. That would be kind of, an important visit. Then we need to reach out to Bangladesh as well. Some telephone call was made between the 2 prime ministers, but then we do not follow up. So it is important to follow up as well and sustain those initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very elaborate answer. Sir, there's a question for Sir Lawrence from Dr. Adil Sultan, who is Dean at the Air University. He says, Sir Lawrence Friedman in his book, The Future of War, has described hybrid war as a full spectrum war which includes the use of terrorism, insurgency, criminality, and conventional operations, along with information operations. With this background, can we differentiate between hybrid war and the 5th generation war? And there's another question from him, that if hybrid wars cannot be deterred and most states start resorting to the use of hybrid war for achieving their political objectives, then what would be the future or relevance of nuclear deterrence? Sir Friedman.
Good questions, but not small ones. I'm very first. I mean, the term 5th generation war has been used. I don't think war goes in generations, particularly. There's obviously certain technological changes. Nuclear weapons are one. Digital age is another, which changes the character. But the actual activities themselves, what you're trying to achieve, the sort of slightly more timeless qualities. And a lot of the discussion suggests that with this sort of a tectonic shift from one type of warfare to another, yeah, and similar sorts of campaigns appear in different eras. So I'm not a great fan of talking about fifth generation warfare, but clearly the digital age has produced different opportunities. My definition of hybrid warfare was really almost a menu, that if you're going to bring different bits together, there's an awful lot of different bits to choose from. And that, I think, is one of the problems that comes with conceptualization. So there's a variety of permutations, shall we say. And I think, a lot of the discussion from the last two speakers is, I think, very much focused on the information side of hybrid conflict, and the way that countries talk about each other, try to undermine each other, and so on. But that's only one part of the overall story. And in many, and that is something that is not at all new, because propaganda could go through the earlier forms of mass media, whereas television, radio, newspapers, and whatever, and still does. These are still important ways. So again, there's nothing. It's not new, but the most damaging new parts may be in the cyber area, about which there seems to perhaps we haven't spoken quite as much, and that's relevant to the deterrence question. It's very different to talk about deterrence with these sorts of activities than it is with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, it tends to be bipolar, whether it's US, Soviet, Russia, or India, Pakistan. Very focused. The violence, there's no mistaking it, and what's involved. And there's a conceptual framework that's quite well established in terms of when you're vulnerable, how you deter, what deterrence means. Now, there's a distinction that's made between deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. So if you think of deterrence in terms of costs and gains, you can deter by reducing gains, the enemy's gains, as well as increasing costs. And we tend to think about deterrence as punitive and increasing costs, but actually, and I think this fits in with what the previous speakers have said, you also can do a lot by resilience, by making it harder for the opponent to achieve gains. And I think that's probably the best way to start thinking about deterrence. For the reasons I gave earlier, it's quite hard to think about areas in which you may be uncertain about attribution, where it may be difficult to work out the exact effects, to be prompting punitive measures. But if you can limit the effects of what the opponent is trying to achieve, then you don't have to worry about that so much. So it's fine, I think, to use terms like deterrence to throw light on these issues, but so long as you realize you're doing something very different to what you were trying to do with nuclear weapons.
Thank you, sir. There are two questions. They are similar in nature for General Amir Riaz, and I'll club them together. One is from Mr. Bilal Shahid, and the other one is from Engineer Siddiqur Rana. The question is, the Global Climate Risk Index has placed Pakistan in 5th place on the list of countries most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. So we can no longer afford to consider climate change as a boutique topic reserved for politicians and academics. Do you foresee the ingress of hybrid warfare tools into areas opened up due to climate stress in the Indo-Pak context? Will terraforming and potentially disruptive geoengineering technologies potentiate hybrid campaigns in the near future? And what key steps can we take to mitigate the inevitable impact of climate change on the vulnerabilities and resilience of our society and systems?
That's also.
General Amir, sir.
Ji. Well, I'm not a specialist on the subject of climate change and its impact because I'm sure it's a very, very deep and wide-ranging subject in itself. But what I can say is that, it is coming from, I'm sure it is coming from the specialists because both these gentlemen seem to have a deep insight into the climate change and its impact, and then using some of these elements as to influence another state's behavior. Well, yes, one could foresee that happening maybe at some stage, but I I cannot really comment on the what could be the impact of this because this is one area where the full impact or the consequences may not be known to the people still. If you try to manipulate with an environmental thing and try to create a situation for another state, that how will it affect the whole region or maybe the world at large? But uh, obviously, human beings are the nature, as Sir Friedman was saying, that we can't see war in generations. It remains a political tool. It eventually activities may take different shapes because of technologies that have become available, and that those technologies change the character of war, but not the nature of war in its essence. So, if these tools do become available to human beings and they start applying, I have a belief that whatever has become available to human beings, they have applied it. Uh, Nuclear weapons were also used, except once the bipolar arrangement of nuclear weapons came into being. So, yes, if this kind of technology comes into the hands of opponents, they may like to use them. What will be the consequences? I think you are yourselves a better judge because you perhaps are a specialist on the subject. I am not. But I can only say, yes, once such tools become available to the opponents or the human beings, they may use them to create influence. What consequences will they have? It is yet to be seen. And I think it requires a very deep scientific research to answer these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I request Sir Lawrence if you would like to make a comment on this question? Sir, you are muted.
Yeah, no, I've unmuted myself. It's the standard cry of Zoom. I think, yeah, I mean, technologies are used. So the nuclear technology was used as soon as it became available, and that made the point. It's an interesting question. If we hadn't had Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what we would have thought thereafter, whether deterrence would have been so effective. But we could see very clearly the effects. The difficulty with the new technologies is very hard, as I keep on saying, to be quite sure what's cause and what's effect. They're certainly used. There's no doubt that the people try to make the most of them, but they're not necessarily, as the other speakers both pointed out, within Pakistan, if you don't have divisions and if you don't have problems, then this sort of stuff isn't going to be so effective. And that would be the basic message I would take as well. So I think this is why, if you talk about the really kinetic stuff like nuclear or even conventional forces, you've got completely different sort of issues than when you're talking about systems that play on people's minds. You can have a precision guided weapon, but it's not so easy to have a precision guided thought. That's what you can just plonk into somebody else's mind. So I think they're very different in kind in that respect.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question for the entire panel from Dr. Mahmood Ahmad. He says, avoiding any response or build-up of wrong beliefs due to false information is comparatively easy to manage at the institutional level than at the individual level. This breach at individual level might amplify the divisions in the society, ethnic or religious, and can create an avalanche effect. What measures media and educational institutes should take to strengthen the required immune system at national level against this warfare? Uh, any of the panelists could answer, or Sir Friedman, if you would
Yeah,
like
I
to
mean,
take
let me
the
just
lead.
back up. I mean, it's the issue is trust, but it's also I mean, I think the mention of education is important. I know in the West there's some discussion of the need. I mean, there is a need um, to, as part of schooling, to help people to understand how to use the internet responsibly and what sort of thing, and how to note when they're getting fake news or dodgy sources. Again, you can see this with the vaccination campaigns, which is sort of a more politically neutral thing to talk about. Um, there's tremendous effort going on in the UK at the moment to convince people that the vaccines are safe, that they don't have microchips implanted in them, that they don't contain pork, for example. All of these things are having to be done, and because by and large the counter information is coming from trusted sources like senior doctors and so on. There's some evidence that it can work. But if the government isn't trusted, then however much it says this isn't true, it's gonna struggle. And I think what you can see in the States, and to some extent in other Western countries, is the development of networks of opinion that are almost impervious to outside influences, and that reinforce each other. You can see this with the QAnon, if any of you have been following that in the States, which is a completely weird conspiracy theory, which is beyond reason in many respects. Yet it's got lots of very devoted followers, and as they only talk to each other, it's hard to break down. So I mean, again, this is not unusual. This is how bodies of opinion form within countries and can be divisive. So I think I don't think that there's not an inoculation against this. I think you can teach people to be discerning, to be careful, but in the end, what you need is trustworthy sources countering it. And to counter, and I think this has been a problem for governments. I don't know enough about Pakistan to comment, but other governments, when they've been trying to counter misinformation, is sometimes they counter real information as well. That is, they get so defensive, they can't admit any mistakes, that because they seem to be dismissing all charges, even those that seem to have some validity, then they're less trusted on where they should be trusted. So I think that it's part of the challenges for governments is to be candid and to acknowledge where there are issues and not get so defensive that they dismiss every criticism as fake news, when clearly not all of it will be. And then they've got greater credibility when they are attacking the fake stuff.
If I have
So thank you very
to,
much. General, sorry, please.
sir, Ambassador Basit, you can go ahead, sir.
Please, you go ahead, please.
All right. If we are talking, if I understood the question correctly, that if there is, what could we do in order to prevent a situation which can come into being through some sectarian, religious, or ethnic, you know, uh, thing being exploited, and it is thrown through maybe digital media and social media to create some emotional stir in the society, and how do the education institutions or anybody else who should be able to respond to it? In my opinion, this we are now living in a world which I have heard it and I've seen it, and I now believe that we live in a world which is now it's a post-truth world, and we have to now start teaching our children at home to be very discerning, to be very careful. And the first thing that we have to teach our children at home, the school and the university and the government comes later, is that we must not respond simultaneously. We must not get agitated to a comment which we read, which is against maybe our core values or something. And we must not respond to it because we are not sure that this is true, this is not true, and this is being injected into the system to create a reaction. So this, we have, as parents, we have to start doing this, and then our schools and our universities and all. So therefore, we first have to teach them to be patient, to be more analyzing, to be more discerning, and then to be able to respond to it intellectually and not through a counter violence. Violence is not just by physical actions. Violence is through words also, and that spreads more rapidly these days. So therefore, we have to start to teach this, and then we have to create credible clusters within our system in our country whose information should be trusted, and they should have that kind of credibility, government and non-government clusters, from where the information, when it comes, it should be trusted. And those should be very, very responsible structures which have to be built within the state. In my opinion, that's the way to respond to such kind of a situation in this kind of a world that we live in.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Basit, do you want to add something?
No, I have nothing to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now there's a question from Karen Fisher from New Delhi for Ambassador Abdul Basit. She says, I'm thinking about the dinner in Delhi at Mani's house after you had just arrived. It was just before Modi came into power, I think. It was a very different India, even though the Hindutva element was always there. I have to disagree about Pakistan's language used about Modi. I think the language cannot be strong enough. What is happening in India prevents any type of engagement. It is also what eventually will pressurize Washington into changing its biased views. We cannot point it out enough and with the strongest language possible. How would you suggest they be described? Their only reason for being is to damage Pakistan and for strictly communal reasons and less for politics. There's another question that is for General Amir Riaz from Ms. Sadia Sattar. How an objective political criticism or dissent be differentiated from a biased attempt of creating false narrative aimed at sabotaging Pakistani nationhood? Ambassador Basit, please.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher, for reminding me of that dinner. I do distinctly remember that. I'm not against using these hard terms or to define what the Modi government is all about. What I was suggesting was that we should avoid using such harsh terms at the leadership level. That was the point I wanted to make. Otherwise, we should do everything possible to expose India's fascist Hindutva regime. But I, as a former diplomat, would not be very comfortable if the leadership gets involved into such rhetoric, because diplomacy has its own way of working, and we need to use whatever language we want to use at the non-leadership level. That is fine with me. As a private citizen, I can say anything I want to say. But at the leadership level, one has to be slightly more circumspect, because this rhetoric, at times boomerangs and comes back and haunts you. So this was the point I was trying to make. Otherwise, I am all for exposing India and what the RSS is all about and what the Hindutva agenda is. And there are no true views about it. Thank you.
As regards the political dissent or differentiating between what is the right kind of political discourse and what is the wrong kind of political discourse, without impinging upon the freedom of speech, if that was the crux of the question that I understood. Freedom of speech is a great idea and it has tremendous merits. But obviously, when we are, what you're trying to ask is that what is the right kind of political discourse, even if it is political dissent, and what is the wrong kind of political discourse. To my manner of thinking, it may vary from person to person. My manner of thinking is that if a political discourse or a political idea which is motivated to create divisions and polarization within the society based on ethnic, racial, sectarian, religious lines, or ideas which are not in consonance with the core values for which the state stands. Any state, all states have their own political philosophy. If we are talking about Pakistan, then Pakistan also has a political philosophy and ideology. Within the confines of that, if there is dissent, it is perfectly fine. Freedom of speech is great. But if it starts to create divisions, it starts to create social, political fissures, that debate needs to be seen very clearly and carefully. And the recent examples are, one of the most powerful state in the world. What happened there in the last few months is a very clear exposition of where the political discourse ends and another type of discourse begins, and where it must be halted. But it is then the responsibility of the people and the state together. It's not just the responsibility of the state. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There are two questions, both for Sir Lawrence. First is from Saeed Mohammad Ali. He's the director at the Center for Aerospace. He says, do you anticipate that with the evolution of non-kinetic means of causing harm to others, gradually humanity will reduce its reliance over force and increase reliance over power to coerce and harm through other means? The second question is from Ms. Saima Aman. How would you define cyber offense and what could be the possible tools that can be employed for regulating the offense side of cybersphere at the international level, considering the possible role it can play in initiating an armed conflict, such as consider sabotage of a vital strategic installation? Sir Friedman.
Yeah, I've understood the questions properly. On the second, offensive cyber is essentially what we fear others doing to us, which is sabotage of some sort. The UK has recently talked about GCHQ, which is the British sort of cyber centre, against ISIS, which was about deception more than anything else, persuading opponents that things were happening in one place when in fact they were happening with another, that there was strength here when it was really weakness, and so on. So there's a variety of ways this can be done rather than just being punitive, which is what offensive cyber normally sounds like. And I think we've got so many examples, a number of examples now, where things have been set in motion in order to attack a particular facility or entity or company or whatever, which have just spread and gone to completely innocent parties who then get extremely cross about it. So I think it's not clear how easy it is when you're using digital means to actually contain it and stop it spreading, which is why one of the reasons I think to be caution on the sabotage side of it. I think the information side is different. On the evolution of non-kinetic means, I'm not sure. I mean, I think the reason why non-kinetic means are important, as I said in my opening remarks, is because the kinetic means are very deadly and we'd rather not resort to them. And the pain and danger is obvious. So there's very good reasons to find alternatives. The difficulty that you have is alternative means are not necessarily decisive. And so a lot of the discussion of cyber and economic sanctions as well as another example is whether they can cause such an effect that in practice an opponent is brought to their knees. Well, you can, I think, economically have a big effect on countries, and it's a form of bullying that that's quite well established and can have an effect. But it depends on the stakes. So, you know, Iran might resist if it feels the whole existence of the state is affected by economic pressure. But if there was a certain sort of shift of policy in a particular area, it might be prepared to contemplate that. So it depends on the stakes as well. So my basic conclusion would be that you can influence events by non-kinetic means. It's better that you do try to influence them than by kinetic means. But you've got to accept that there are limits on what you can achieve by those sort of means, because in the end, they're not necessarily decisive, that it's possible to risk and survive. So I think that would be my conclusion.
Thank you, sir. I'll club three questions together for General Amir. And the first one is from Ms. Ranvay Ajaz. The EU Disinfo Lab revelations suggest that for 15 long years, disinformation operations have served Indian interests, undermining Pakistani position. At this point, what role Pakistani think tank community must play to deal with such challenges? There's a related question from Farat Rana. Sir, do you think our media cell is not as active as it should be? We are far behind to portray a positive Pakistan. And the third question, related question is from Mr. Ali Jabir. Do you think the media fraternity and policy makers alike are unprepared to cope with the threat of hybrid warfare unleashed by the enemy countries against Pakistan? And is there a need to hold a national dialogue to develop stakeholders' awareness on hybrid warfare? General Amir, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, regarding the disinformation lab, which was in operation across Europe and US and many other parts of the world, and which has now been very clearly found out to have been embedded in those systems using third countries by the Indians. And you have to understand that this was being done by a central concept which was developed obviously under the tutelage of the Indian intelligence agency, RAW, and it must have had the direct approval of the highest Indian authorities. So it was the Indian establishment helped, or with the approval of the leadership, they went into this venture, because this cannot be done with the help of a state. It cannot be the function of a group or a couple of acting on their own. So it was a cohesive operation, very well organized, very well arranged, and it did work for a long period of time. And unfortunately, it was being helped, some by default, some by design, by some of our own people in those countries who've been part of these disinformation labs, whether knowingly or unknowingly, I don't know, that still has to be found out. So you should understand that this was being done as a state activity. As I told you, that a dime fill is a concept that was being applied in this. Information and intelligence were being put together, and this was organized by the state of India. Central role was played by RAW. In order to respond to this, first of all, it has to be, the think tank's role will come into play, or you can exploit this, you can talk about it, you can talk, because now you have the truth under your control, and you can use that truth to build the right kind of narrative to expose the Indians, and that can be anybody's game, not only the Pakistani think tanks. The others should also look into this kind of a venture, because it has really maligned Pakistan for too long, and the Western opinions have been, some of the Western opinions have been shaped by such disinformation labs. So there's a need for critical analysis by those Western nations as well. But coming back to this, the response to this essentially lies in the domain of intelligence and information coming together. And this response should be backed up by the state, because this is not one time. This is going to happen again. We might have just touched tip of the iceberg. There might be much more that is happening within our own state and in other states. So it will have to have backing of the state to counter this. And in the terms of the intelligence world, it is called the counterintelligence response to it. And obviously, then this response spreads like the octopus into various other parts to find out what is happening where. So first need is to find out that have we discovered all, or it is just the beginning of it. And we first have to discover this all, and we have to take support of our friends in the West also to help us in finding out what has happened. Second is, obviously, you said think tanks. Think tanks can play a role, and think tanks can be engaged into this, and they can become part of this. Now, I would say information campaign, not a disinformation campaign. This information campaign is to burst the bubble of disinformation campaign of Indians, and think tanks can do that, obviously. The second thing, the second part of the, what was the second part, sir? I missed. There was another question. There were three questions. This was the first question. Sorry.
Yes, yes. So that was I have also lost track of that question. Okay, I'll just see to that, sir.
Okay.
Since we are running short of time, and I'm grateful to our speakers who gave me ample time for the questions, and the questions are continuously pouring in. We'll have last 2 or 3 questions.
There was a media.
We'll
Sorry. There was a media. They said the media cell is not doing well in Pakistan. It's not a media cell. Please, you have to try and understand. It's not media cell. It is. If you have to put up, yes. Let's say our media is. I think Ambassador Basit has very aptly said that perhaps our media does not have the capacity or capability to understand the real issues of, let's say, which are coming through hybrid warfare from India, and how is it affecting our state. This is not being well understood because our media construct at this moment is perhaps not at that kind of a capacity. So it's not just one media cell we are talking about here. Here we are talking about a larger narrative, and that larger narrative then runs its course. And I say that there are 2 types of narratives. One is which goes into the ecosystem, and it stays in the ecosystem for a longer duration of time. It becomes part of the public discourse. It becomes part of the media discourse. It becomes part of the intellectual discourse. It becomes part of the state discourse. And eventually, at the right time, it eventually becomes part of your diplomatic discourse and ends up into an effective lawfare somewhere at an international forum, multilateral forum, where your narrative has then reached with the right kind of backing. That's what I look at it, and I call it is part of the ecosystem. Then there is something called as echo. When you speak louder in the mountains and your voice returns, it returns one time. It's very loud. That kind of response is also required sometimes to shallow, shorter-lived narrative which is emanating from somewhere else. In order to discern the whole thing and knit it together into a campaign, it is not just one media cell. It is a larger narrative, and it is then run by several people, including intellectuals, think tanks, media, digital media, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Last 3 questions. The first one is from Marshal Fahim Malik, who is a director at the CAS. What is the possibility for Pakistani polity to look at the entire Indian architect and design of anti-Pakistan overtures and conspiracies in a holistic manner and create a comprehensive counter response? He is hinting at Indian threatening attempts since our inception, and as varied as water, finance, terrorism, commerce, military occupation, espionage, diplomatic lies, media, and almost everything. The second question is hybrid war in Pakistan's context different in its manifestation from widely understood and accepted concepts of hybrid war the world over? And the third question is from Tahir Dinsha. As Pakistan is getting closer to China, American human assets in institutions like military or judiciary will play against Pakistan and put their weight along the other side of the fence in hybrid war. So I will request Jal Amir to answer these questions, and maybe Ambassador Basit, if he would like to add at the end.
I can only respond to the first question, in which he's talking about creating an overall paradigm of understanding of how the Indian polity and how the Indian society, let's say, thinks about Pakistan. Uh, and right from Pakistan's inception to this point. This also reminds me of the third question, which was that can we create a common understanding within our political leadership all across the political divide about the hybrid warfare as it is being perpetrated against Pakistan, and to develop at least a common level of understanding. Yes, it can be done. And you said that there's a need for a, let's say, a dialogue or a national level dialogue. I don't know if the national level dialogue is required or not, but I do know that there is already a possibility. There's already the political construct is such that you can put all the political parties together, and they can be given an exhaustive understanding of what is happening to Pakistan and from where it is happening and for what purpose it is happening and what effects it is going to achieve, and how our political behaviors, how our political weaknesses, political instability, and political polarization will open those critical vulnerabilities which will be exploited by our opponents, may they be residing in India or on behalf of India, they're residing elsewhere. So, yes, that effort can be made, but eventually it has to be within the political parties. They have to have the right kind of people, the right kind of specialists embedded within the political parties themselves to give them this kind of an understanding that what is going on and how our political behaviors, our political discourses will affect positively or negatively on the hybrid campaign which is being launched against Pakistan. Yes, as regarding Marshall's question, that yes, it can be institutionalized. Maybe we can create an institution which continuously studies the Indian evolution of Indian political thought and social thought and vis-a-vis military thought as to against Pakistan. And I am sure that it is not the entire Indian society which looks at Pakistan from that standpoint, where perhaps the present Indian leadership does. But we still need to have maybe an institutional platform or several institutional platforms and research going on in different universities to see the evolution of Indian thought vis-a-vis how do they view Pakistan from the time of partition to this point. Somebody said that they have not still accepted this. They call it that this was a mistake that happened. Yes, there is a group of people who happen to be now mostly in power, that it was a mistake that happened, partition of subcontinent. But then the counter question is very simple, which Pakistanis don't raise, and we don't wish to raise that, because we believe that a reasonable Indian federation, if it changes its ways, manners and method, it is to everybody's advantage. But India never existed as a one country until 1947 in the present construct of federation or union. It came into being after 1947. So it was an Indian subcontinent which existed, not a state of India that existed. So, but that's a long debate. So therefore, yes, there could be institutions which can carry out this research and create a reasonable understanding amongst our younger political leaders who to eventually come and take over the reins of this country. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I'm grateful to all the speakers for giving such elaborate answers to all the questions, and I would apologize to all the attendees who put up their questions, and we could not address those questions because of the paucity of time. I'll now request Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat, President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, for his concluding remarks. Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat. Sir, you're muted. Still muted.
Okay. Same mistake over and over.
Sir, you're muted again.
Is this okay now, I think?
Yep.
Okay. Uh, my compliments to all the speakers. We have been at it for an hour and 45 minutes, and every second, every minute of it has been interesting. The credit goes to the panelists because the questions that we had posed them, they provided direct answers to those questions. They didn't beat about the bush. They didn't circumnavigate the difficult issues, etc. And Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman conceptualized it well, clarified the relationship between kinetic and non-kinetic means, etc., and their utility and their usefulness, etc. And also highlighted the issue of credibility, that if the fake news or fake information campaign continues for very long, it loses credibility, and that's the end. There are so many issues that have been raised that I would seek the permission of the panelists to say a few points of my own before I pick and choose the more important ones that they have made, time permitting. So the first point that I wish to make is that the question we posed as to why do the citizens of Pakistan, some of them, turn their back on the country and on the narrative that it has. This was a recurring theme, and General Amir Riaz had to answer many questions on this, and he very correctly identified that the social contract needs to be implemented, and it needs to get the emphasis that is required. Where we have gone wrong is that the social contract that our forefathers envisaged for us was very simple. In the objectives resolution, there were 5 issues of freedom, democracy, social justice, tolerance, and equality. And if we look back, if this constituted our social contract, then to evaluate what state is that social contract in, we need to see that of these 5 objectives, which objectives have been attained, or if they have been attained partially or wholly or not at all. And we would get the answer for the cleavages and fissures that we have been able to create or we are experiencing. So, and that links in with the other point. The enemy or the enemies of Pakistan, or for that matter any country, would do what they want to do, what they have to do, what they think is there in their national interest. But what we have to do is to do what is in our national interest. And so sometimes there is this feeling of victimization that, you know, India is victimizing us, and this emotion overtakes us sometimes. We need to ask ourselves, are we doing something in return or on the same lines, or are we attempting to do something in return on the same lines? We would not find a clear answer for the simple reason that some of these are in the classified domain. However, the indication of success or otherwise would be available if we were to notice a disinfo lab kind of occurrence taking place in reverse. So far, that has not happened. So that is why there is this emphasis by all the speakers of the steps that we need to take to be able to do this. And very rightly pointed out by Ambassador Basit that it's not the leadership who should confront the other leadership directly or call them names, etc. It's the rest of the links in the chain that have to be more proactive for them to be able to have any effect or to build up a coherent picture or a coherent strategy to be able to do this job. The other issue is often raised is about, not related to this, but it came up during discussion, is that Pakistan, and Ambassador Basit raises that Pakistan would be blamed if the talks, intra-Afghan talks fail, and you know there are hurdles created by which the foreign forces do not withdraw. Actually, I find this quite incomprehensible, that if the Afghan government and the US military or the other political agents, etc., sitting over there cannot influence the Afghan factions, how can Pakistan sitting outside of Afghanistan influence them and make them come around to the table and do the bidding of the what the government and the Americans are unable to do? The other issue again was raised is why, of course, the other issue is that Pakistan is engulfed in this US-China rivalry, and that emboldens India, and that American support for India strengthens India, and it condones some of the actions of Indians. And obviously that becomes problematic for us. So, but the claim that is made against Pakistan that it's a debt trap, etc., the way to handle it is to lay down our debt profile out in the open. And when you do that, you will realize that the Chinese loans are not falling due for the next perhaps 2 decades. What we are paying today is the debt that we accumulated a decade or a decade and a half ago. That is falling due for payment, not the Chinese loan. So that logic has no weight. And this also links with the CPEC, the hostility or the opposition to CPEC also is linked to the same problem. So these are the few points that I wanted to make from my side. I'll just go over a few of the important points made by the speakers. Sir Lawrence Friedman made a valid point that this war has been going on forever, and it has shifted from, as the technology has shifted from nuclear to digital, etc., and it goes on. And he also said that there has to be follow-up, there has to be linkage between kinetic and non-kinetic activity, and only then it will bear fruit. And non-kinetic means often are not enough, but kinetic means are becoming so costly and unthinkable that there is a reluctance to resort to open conflict these days, obviously in the nuclear era. Both Ambassador Basit very ably enumerated the Indian objectives vis-a-vis Pakistan and how they are synchronized. And very ably, he also pointed out to the fact that we should be able to, or should try to set our house in order. That's the bottom line of our defensive effort. Within the defensive effort also, there is another issue that needs to be understood, and that is that an offensive information operation can, for a temporary period, be based on falsehood. But the defensive mechanism has to be based on truth for it to be acceptable and for it to work. And it has to be over the long term. So it ties in with, again, our effort to set our house in order and to take our media and other entities that will contribute to this effort to go along together. And General Amir Riaz was the last speaker, but he very ably not only enumerated the steps that we should take to defend ourselves better, to put out a narrative that will work, and also the mechanism and the elements of that narrative or that strategy, how it is to go, could become useful and effective. And Ambassador Basit also made a point that we should, General Amir Riaz made this point, the two important pillars of mending ties with India, that India must stop this effort at hybrid warfare against Pakistan and return to diplomatic activity if the relations are to improve. So I think we have had a very interesting discussion, very fruitful discussion. There was plenty of time for the questions, and the questions were of good quality. And I'm personally very satisfied with the quality of the discussion that has gone on over the last almost 2 hours. In the end, let me thank the moderator, the speakers, and the participants for their interest. and for their participation wholeheartedly. Thank you very much. Wherever you
Thank
are,
you.
have a good evening, good afternoon,
Thank
good
you.
night.
Thank you very much.
So
Sir.
Thank you, Professor.
so thank you very much.
Professor.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Before we conclude, I would again like to thank our speakers for their valuable insights and answering the questions posed by the participants. I'm also thankful to all the participants. And as the CAS tradition goes, we started on time and finished just about 3 minutes late. So thank you very much and a very good evening to all.